Well, it's certainly a privilege to be with you once again. I cannot express to you my thankfulness for you, the congregation, the lovingness that everybody here has shown me. You know what? I hardly know where to begin, but if you're hoping for a shorter lesson because of my weakened condition, I'm going to disappoint you. But maybe I should take the advice of Scripture, let not him that puts on his armor boast as he that takes it off. So I haven't got going yet. No, I did want to, on a serious note, thank you so much for all of your love and compassion. What a loving congregation this is. And I didn't know what was going to take place. Sometimes, as a doctor told Nita this week, he said, I didn't know where he's going to be either. I didn't know if I'd wake up in Beulah land with my mother or not. So, but at any rate, been happy to see my sainted mother, but I'm happy to be here. I'm thankful to my wife particularly for all the labor she's done. Everything that the whole way is just an amazing thing with my family and the church family here. Thank you so much for all that you mean to me and the love that you've shown. I have people sending cards, bringing food, visiting, and it's just really, really great to be with you today. And I'm just so proud to be a part of this congregation. What a loving congregation. So before I lose myself in that, let's turn attention to our text, which is 1 Kings 11. And you might or may not recall that we were looking at life lessons from the kings. And so in 1 Kings chapter 11, in a lesson which I call Judgment, the Wind and the Whirlwind. As we're thinking about 1 Kings 11, I want to open with a notice of Hosea chapter 8 and verse 7, the language from which this lesson is entitled. And that is, when they sow wind, they shall reap the whirlwind. And Hosea, an 8th century BC prophet, came about a century after the kingdom split, was where we are, about 922 BC. Hosea was pointing out the fact that a truism is simply a statement that is always true. It's how God has ordered the world, and that is, when people sow the wind, or sow wind, they reap the whirlwind. That is to say that there is a natural consequence that God has built into the system between our actions, individually, familially, as a family, and also nationally. There are natural consequences that are built into our actions and the repercussions that will always follow, and that's the way God has built the system. In other words, Hosea is pointing out that when people go and plant seeds in the furrows in their gardens, they expect a crop, and they are, of course, purposeful. They're putting a particular seed in. But Old Testament Ephraim, the northern kingdom to whom he is preaching, had practiced idolatry. They had practiced internationalism instead of reliance upon God. They had practiced wickedness on many different fronts, and consequently, the natural result of that will be reaping the whirlwind. Solomon, toward his latter years, had been sowing wind. He had lost his focus upon God, his godliness, and he introduced into the kingdom of Israel idolatry. He had introduced a waywardness from God. Wickedness was in its wake. And that was what was taking place in Solomon's kingdom. The people of Israel were disenchanted with Solomon's rule at this particular point. Not only because of the political ramifications that had occurred, but because of the wickedness that was at the top. And it trickled down into the society itself. Disregarding God in government means that people are also going to disregard God on the bottom. The trickle-down theory is true. In economics, it means, of course, if we, as a government, put a lot of pressure by taxes and regulations upon business owners, the people who suffer are going to be who? Those on the bottom, those who are the employees of those particular businesses. It works that way regarding morality or immorality in a kingdom as well. When immorality becomes the case in Washington, D.C., or I mean Israel, then that's also going to be the case in society as a whole. And so the trickle-down theory has always been true. It's a truism. It works Unfortunately, in Solomon's kingdom, as he introduced all of the waywardness and disobedience to God, and the people themselves became disregarding of God's law and commandments. That's number one. Number two, Solomon also had a son who was ready to take the reins of government. His name was Rehoboam. Rehoboam had been brought up without a daddy in the home. Remember, Solomon had 1,000 women at his request, 700 wives, 300 concubines. The boys were brought up without a father's instruction. They were brought up without a nuclear family. Consequently, they were brought up in state schools. That's exactly what it was. The royal family was a state school. It was state-sponsored. That's how Rehoboam was brought up. And he therefore had very little regard for God himself. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Not only so, but Solomon had introduced into Israel an internationalism. Now, relations with foreign countries is always good, to be on good relations, but internationalism was something a little bit different. It was that he was intertwining himself and the kingdom of Israel with foreign nations. No longer was it a nationalistic fervor. No longer was it the simple, solitary life that the farmers had known in Israel, where every man was at peace under his own vine and fig tree in the expressive language of Scripture. But instead, Solomon had brought in international forces by making alliances with all these nations, and the people streamed in over the border, and finally, the people that came in had not the knowledge of God. They had not the principles of a God-given government. They had not the ideas of honoring God at all, and this deleted or had a deleterious effect upon the kingdom of Israel. And you know what the saddest thing was? You can read 1 Kings all the way through chapter 11, where we are, and you will see the absence of something that is so important. This would be the fourth element of their downfall, and that is that God had appointed, according to the book of Leviticus, the preachers, the people who were in the pulpits, to call attention to the downward slide of Israel and to go about in Israel teaching statutes and ordinances. But you don't read of a thing like that at all. Instead, the pulpits were silent. They were complicit. They simply gave the stamp of approval upon Solomon's demise. And you don't read about a preacher one raising his voice of opposition to the apostasy that was taking place in Solomon's day. You don't read about it. Why is that the case? Because they wanted to be evidently politically correct. And you'll find the same thing. You think we're talking about Israel, but we're talking about America also, aren't we? That's exactly what was happening in Solomon's rule. Consequently, God raised up adversaries against Solomon without and within. There were adversaries without, and the text reads in 1 Kings 11 that God raised up these adversaries. What does that mean? It means that God's providence was behind the scenes, orchestrating the events. It doesn't mean that the free will of individuals was released. It doesn't mean that the different kings of different nations did not exercise their free will, because they all had their own ambition and ambitious desires against Israel. But nevertheless, God overruled it all to bring about disparity in Israel and a thorn in the side of Solomon in his latter years. We'll start from the south, we'll go to the north. In the south, by the southeast, was a nation called Edom. We'll reach back to the days of Solomon's daddy, David. David had, remember, warred with all of the surrounding nations, and one of the two major wars that David was engulfed in was against the Edomites to the southeast, and you can see it on the map, to the southeast of the Dead Sea. The Edomites were almost exterminated completely. As a matter of fact, the slaughter was so wholesale that Joab, David's commander-in-chief, stayed behind 6 months for a mopping up campaign, bury the dead, and erase what was left of the Edomites. But there was a a royal family in Edom, and they secreted away a young man by the name of Hadad, and they escaped to the country of Egypt by the deserts of Midian. When Hadad and his family, the young prince, arrived in Egypt, the Pharaoh welcomed them and gave them a place at his own table. As a matter of fact, we are told here in 1 Kings 11 that the Pharaoh offered the hand of his sister Tahpenes to Hadad to wife. Now that meant the Pharaoh was making alliances politically as well as family with the Edomites, just as he had already done with Solomon. Politics, isn't that something? But Hadad nursed a hatred of Israel. And when he saw Solomon began to have a demise in his kingdom, he took his wife and his family, against Pharaoh's advice, back to Edom and set up a kingdom again. It was just a small little country at this point in Solomon's latter days, but nevertheless, he brought about a marauding campaign against Solomon. So there was one problem that Solomon faced, and that was on his southeastern border. The same thing occurred in the northeast. Once again, reaching back to David's time, he had captivated and captured the the Syrian people, and that would be the northeast people, the Syrians. They had a man by the name of Rezon, R-E-Z-O-N, who fled the country just the same as Hadad had fled Edom, had secreted himself away as a princely scion of that family. And when Solomon came to power, he stayed away. But as Solomon's popularity and his power began to wane because of God's providence, then Rezon came back into the picture in Syria and began causing problems on Solomon's northeast border. So there were problems without, and that was providential because of Solomon's sin. But there were also problems not only as far as adversaries without, but there were problems within. One of the things that Solomon incorporated into Israel was high taxation. It's hard for us to imagine, but all of the fabulous building projects that Solomon incorporated into Israel and engulfed himself in, such as the temple, his own palace, the house of the forest of Lebanon, which was really an armory right there in Jerusalem, building the walls of Jerusalem, building cities in different places, having large stables that were placed in Megiddo for his chariotry. All of these things cost a lot of money. So what Solomon did was, and at first it was welcomed, he had every man in Israel of a certain age bracket, every family head, would 1 month in 3, that would be 1/3 of the year, 1 month in 3 he would go to Jerusalem, and they would be put in different places to work in Solomon's kingdom. Now that would mean something. That would mean what? That would mean the taxation was 1/3. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? 1/3 of their paycheck. They're working for the government. Does that sound familiar again? Well, when Rehoboam came to the throne after Solomon died, one of the first complaints was, we want the taxes lowered. I think about Richard Henry Lee, who was of our own Constitutional Convention, also part of the drafting committees of the Declaration of Independence. And in the debates in those days, the Continental Congress, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood up and said this. He said, if we don't separate, he wanted to separate from England, not all of them did. If we don't separate, they might raise our taxes to 10%. They thought that was tyranny. Boy, wouldn't that be the day? Tyranny, 10%. Look what Solomon was doing. Look what's happening today. Look what's happening today. We also work 1/3 of the year, but that caused such an irritation among the people. Solomon's taxation policies continued on after the temple was built, after his palace was built. He maintained a table, and a fabulous amount of food was required, and people had to continue to work. It was slave labor to keep up his food rations, and people were tired of it. And so they were irritated because of the high taxation. But there was also this interesting thing, the tribal jealousy between the north and the south. Once again, we're thinking like, that sounds like America. Just think for a moment, when the kingdom split, the northern tribes were dominated by the largest one, which was called Ephraim, the house of Joseph. That was the largest tribe. And Ephraim had much to be proud of. They had, number one, they had military leaders. Much of the military personnel came from the tribe of Ephraim, the great heroes of yesteryear. For example, Joshua had been an Ephraimite. So also had Deborah and Barak of the days of Judges. They had been Ephraimites. So also had Abimelech, one of the judges. Samuel himself had been an Ephraimite, much to be proud of in their military prowess. It's kind of interesting to note that when David had, by his own sin, brought about people rebelling against him, remember Shebna, who brought about a rebellion against David? He was from Ephraim as well. There was a natural cleavage between the north and the south, and Ephraim had a tribal jealousy. Not only so, but Solomon apparently exacerbated it by not taxing the Judahites, because he was from Judah, as heavily as the northern tribes. That irritated everyone. When Saul died, the man who preceded David, his son was named Ishbosheth, and the people who championed his cause, you guessed it, they were from Ephraim. Therefore, now, when Solomon is passing away, the northern tribes are demanding a reprieve. The tribal jealousy had been intense. Not only so, but you think about the northern tribes and the territory that is called Ephraim, which incorporates all of the northern tribes. They had also had ecclesiastical supremacy in some sense as well. They didn't have Jerusalem and the temple. But where was the first tabernacle located? Do you recall? Shiloh, Ephraimite territory. It had been removed to Kiriath Jearim. Where was that located? Ephraim. They had ecclesiastical superiority in their mind because the first place the tabernacle had been, the place that God had put the tabernacle, was Shiloh in Ephraim. That is regardless of the fact that God did choose to put his name in Jerusalem. That's the way they felt about it. But even more so, if you're going to look from a human standpoint as to who has the advantage, geographically, topographically, who would it be? If you look at the map that is in front of you, you will see that it all belongs to Ephraim, the northern kingdom. The beautiful valley of Jezreel, the valley of Esdraelon, called the valley of Megiddo, sits right there in the center. It's the breadbasket of the country, sits right in the heart of Ephraim. They also have the harbors right on the shoreline. Akko, which became known as Ptolemais, which is just north of Mount Carmel. And Mount Carmel, what a beautiful sight. The beautiful mountains of Carmel, and on the slopes of it, the plains of Sharon that are spoken about poetically in the book of Song of Solomon. You think about the great cities that are there also, or as you might notice on the map, one of the most beautiful inland lakes of fresh water was right there in Ephraimite territory, and that would be the Sea of Galilee. Because Mount Hermon, 10,000 feet, was right in their territory. And all of the waters bubbling out of the ground, the artesian springs that formed the Jordan River, began right there in Ephraim. They had all of the advantages, didn't they? Just stop for a moment and think, what does Judah have? The Dead Sea? The Dead Sea? You've seen pictures of the Dead Sea and the surrounding territory? It looks terrible, doesn't it? You've seen pictures of Masada, dry mountain. Looked like you're in my home of Phoenix, Arizona. Just, there's nothing there. It's just all sand. Much of Judah was that way. They called it the Negev. But Ephraim had all of that geography. Not only so, but they had seaports, as I mentioned, Akko. Joppa now was gone to the Philistines in the end of Solomon's reign because they reasserted themselves. So Judah was left with very little. Small territory, a few people. So the tribal jealousy, you can see, would build up in Ephraim. But there was something else that we need to note that really brings Solomon's reign to a head. And that man's name is Jeroboam. Jeroboam came from the Jordan Valley. The home of Jeroboam was just a small little place, Zeredah. You can't even see it on the map, but it's right in there, just near a place called Sukkoth, S-U-C-C-O-T-H. You can find it in your Bible map. It was an out-of-the-way hamlet. But worse than that, Jeroboam's mother was a widow. Her name was Uriah. She was a widow. Now, in those days, a widow had no way of making a living. They were in abject poverty, and Jeroboam came from that. But Jeroboam was part of Solomon's task workers and put to slave labor. But Solomon recognized that Jeroboam was a man of industry. He's called in 1 Kings 11 a mighty man of valor. And soon enough, Solomon places him over all the taskmasters and all of the laborers from Ephraim itself. Jeroboam has risen in the ranks to the very top. But Jeroboam has other ideas as well. Jeroboam wants to take the kingdom. Once again, this is the providence of God. And one day, while he's walking out of Jerusalem, there is one prophet now whom we meet, and his name is Ahijah. He meets Jeroboam and prophesies, and this is Jeroboam's desire. He says, the desire of your heart will be given you. You'll be given the kingdom of Israel. It will be taken away from the house of David and Solomon himself, except for two tribes, and that would be, of course, Judah and Benjamin. And not only so, but it will not take place in Solomon's day. But Jeroboam was now designated by the prophet of God as the leader. So Solomon's kingdom was for demise. So let's think about the lessons that we learn, practical for us as well. I want you to notice, number one, the providence of God that was occurring. The providence of God is God behind the scenes, orchestrating through natural means the events that occur. You might think about passages such as Genesis 45 and verse 5, in which Joseph spoke to his brothers after 30 years, long time in captivity, now risen to the second in command of Egypt, and his brothers are begging for mercy before him. And he had the power to put them away. And when they discovered his identity, they were frightened. But Joseph makes a magnanimous statement, a great loving statement, because he recognizes even behind the dark clouds, whether it be poor health or the sadnesses that occur in life, losing loved ones, or a country on the downslide, there is always the smiling face of God behind the clouds. And here's what Joseph said: be not grieved or angry with yourselves that you sold me here. God sent me here to preserve your life. And that quelled their fears. That gave them solace and comfort in a time when they thought they would be punished. We run down the timeline to the book of Esther, when Esther, remember, was queen in Persia. And her father-in-law, Mordecai, or uncle rather, wanted her to go to speak to Artaxerxes the king and speak to him and give reprieve to the people of Israel, whom he had already given a command to exterminate. Esther was afraid at first, but he says, if you do not speak at this time, God will raise up someone from another place. And who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. God's providence is always operative. And so even though things may look dismal and sad in America, in Israel, God's smiling face is behind the clouds, awaiting for us to be faithful, relying upon him, God's providence. Number two, you'll notice this, and you cannot help but notice, contemporary events do not always tell the tale, do they? If you were living in Israel at the end of Solomon's reign, and you had to choose a side where to live, you would probably choose, or I might choose, the northern kingdom of Israel, because it had all the advantages. We've already seen the advantages it had. It looked as if it was going to be a powerhouse politically. It looked like it was going to be a powerhouse economically, and Judah was nothing. A little hill, Jerusalem, beautiful as it was, in the middle of a desert. That wasn't going to be anything. But so different are God's plans that if we had chosen that, we would have been mistaken. What meets the eye is not always what God's plans are. And so contemporary events do not always spell what God has in mind. And that brings us to the passage with which we began. Remember Hosea making the statement, "You've sown wind, you'll reap the whirlwind." Now I want to ask this question as we conclude. Why has God made that the case? The answer is singular, and it is because of God's love. That's why. Individually, nationally, He wants us to be able to see through history, and particularly biblical history, that when we make certain decisions that are godless in orientation, that the natural accruing of the events are going to take us away from God. And it's not going to be well for us in the end. Decisions bring about consequences, and those consequences God has built into the system. It's a loving element of God's character, that He's put this in place for you, for me. Because right now, it's discouraging looking in the country, isn't it? It is discouraging. I cannot help but think that America is on a collision course with eternal destiny because of the decisions we have made in the past, regardless of the good news that has come out of the Supreme Court within the last few days. We've made some horrible decisions and had some terrible leadership, and godlessness has been really our byword in America. That's been the case. But God has put into place different elements that will naturally occur to cause us to choose the good individually and as congregations in spite of what takes place nationally. It's the same thing with Israel in that day. If you had been in Judah, it had been a pretty sad day to see the kingdom split, to see secession, there we mentioned the word, to see secession in a country that you thought was united because all you're left with was a small country. But God's purposes and plans and His will are what we cannot necessarily see, because finally God's face comes out from behind the clouds and we see it and we rejoice and are glorious in it. So the lesson is yours. If you've not been faithful, now's the time that we can make our lives right with God. If you come to the front, we will assist you in any action of obedience. If you're not a Christian, remember, by faith, repentance, baptism into Christ, that's the wording of Galatians 3:27, you're baptized into Christ, takes you without, puts you with Him. If you're not a Christian, or if you've been unfaithful, now's the time to make it right while we stand and sing the song.